None of the billions being promised were going to the WTA. Companies weren't just chasing Eala. They were abandoning the tour altogether. A 19-year-old Filipino had surpassed a professional circuit built over 50 years in terms of financial usefulness. Not by dominating the Grand Slam or rankings, but by something much more dangerous to the system: pure, unbridled cultural allure. And the tennis community did more than just raise eyebrows when the financial figures began to come out. It did not breathe. For what was happening was not a sponsorship story. There was a change in power. A tennis skirt masquerading as a modest corporate revolution. And they didn't even see the WTA coming. You'll see why the most important battle in women's tennis right now isn't taking place on any court if you pay close attention. A particular kind of athlete transcends its sport before it appropriately recognizes them. It was Muhammad Ali. It was Serena Williams. Alexandria Eala is now completely overhauling their marketing plans and executing it on a scale that includes business boardrooms from Manila to Manhattan. Whether the WTA institution approves of it or not, Eala brought something to professional tennis that no coaching manual teaches. She was born in the Philippines, brought up with strict discipline, and trained at the Rafael Nadal Academy in Morca. Her story connected with billions of people in Southeast Asia, Europe, and America at the same time. It was a true cross-continental, multi-generational story. Long before the rankings caught up, businesses observed what marketing executives covertly refer to as a great cultural convergence brought about by this combination: the underdog location, the elite European training ground, and the contagious personality. Eala's social media following had surpassed that of many players with higher rankings by the time she was making waves on the WTA tour. She had higher than average Instagram interaction rates for a tennis player. Any athlete in any sport, wherever in the world, might use them. Brands that gauge real audience connection do it by gauging genuine communities' emotional investment rather than just counting. We are looking at data that prompted their analysts to double-check. Sports companies, high-end watch manufacturers, tech giants, and telecom companies with sizable Southeast Asian customer bases. They weren't just curious. Behind closed doors, they were engaged in fierce competition. Discussions were progressing from tentative discussions to significant cash commitments. Crucially, these conversations were not taking place via WTA-affiliated means. They were headed straight to the representative of Eala. This distinction is quite significant. The WTA operates a traditional sports marketing system. Income models built around the community, official tour alliances, and centralized sponsorships. For decades, that approach worked perfectly. However, it was designed for a different era, one in which a single athlete might garner more online attention than the entire organization endorsing her. Eala stood for everything that the previous model had failed to take into consideration. A player whose personal brand gravity was completely removing sponsors from the tour's orbit. Not through confrontation or disagreement, but simply by being there and engaging with audiences at a frequency that was too high for the institutional voice of the WTA. There were a lot of murmurs inside tennis circles. Brand partners began informing agents of other players that budget allocations were being examined. Sponsors of the tournament started to get more subdued responses to proposals for rejuvenation. Women's tennis wasn't losing money. It was going in the direction of a single, distinct center of cultural gravity. There was a name for that point. There was a backhand to that point that might disrupt conversations. And that was only the beginning. Pose this question to yourself. When was the last time a teenager forced multi-billion-dollar companies to completely reevaluate their approach to sports marketing? Because it had already come by that time. There is a technique for numbers to get out of rooms. It was never intended that they would go. The figures pertaining to Alex AA's individual sponsorship portfolio that were being discussed in private conversations were not minor endorsement deals. Professional tennis players outside of the top 10 typically land mid-tier setups, but they weren't the norm. A type of financial commitment that put a player still rising in the ranks of commercial talks, often reserved for seasoned Grand Slam champions, was represented in the private term sheets that were disseminated in preliminary agreements. According to reports from sports business circles, each brand gives comparable numbers that, when added up over numerous agreements, created a total portfolio value estimated in the billions rather than the millions when projected over multi-year commitments. According to reports, one of the frontrunners was a telecom giant with significant market penetration in Southeast Asia. Numerous sportswear companies entered crucial discussions by interpreting the cultural imprint controlled throughout a big and growing customer population. She was considered indispensable by tech companies looking for genuine ambassador voices in emerging areas. The structure, not just the scale, was what set these offerings apart. Brands weren't coming to a team unsure of how she would fit into the frames of the WTA neighboring collaboration. They were creating whole custom setups, creative collaborations, ownership stakes, and sponsored content initiatives. Long-term ambassador structures that regarded her as more than just an athletic endorsement, but as a media entity. In an interview with industry publications, a sports marketing analyst characterized the situation with startling candor. Brands have made the fundamental decision that going around the tour rather than through it was a more effective way to access the emotional connection you created with the audience. Although useful for reaching sizable tennis audiences, the WTA's formal partnership infrastructure was unable to provide the same level of personal connection to the fervently devoted, culturally unique communities that followed you. This information had serious financial ramifications for the WTA. The collective loses leverage when businesses shift sponsorship funds from organizational agreements to individual athlete deals outside of tour facilities. Other players lose visibility. Financial sources are lost by smaller competitors. The burden is felt by the entire ecosystem. This is the aspect that actually made the stress higher. Eala wasn't creating this situation. She wasn't putting herself in a hostile position toward any organization. Her representation was only using the appropriate business strategy to meet extraordinary market demand. Revolt is not what that is. That's business. However, the WTA's penalties were the same regardless of its goal. Tour execs were having heated conversations behind closed doors. When one of its members turns into a more desirable individual investment than the group platform, how can an organization maintain sponsorship significance? In order to accommodate an athlete whose personal audience outnumbers institutional reach, how may commercial frameworks designed for a pre-social media context be reorganized? These were no longer strategic, hypothetical questions. They needed answers right away, and the WTA seems to be looking for them far too slowly for reasons that will soon become very apparent. Whether you deserved these offers wasn't the big question. No one really contested that. Much more unsettling was the question that was tearing through tennis boardrooms. Could the WTA ever fully regain the commercial story? And had they already lost it? When there is a systemic catastrophe, silence is never really quiet. It conveys everything. The WTA's official channels of communication were noticeably silent as the brand discussions surrounding Alexia were heating up and the sports industry media was starting to make official connections. There was only institutional inaction at the precise moment when decisive action was most needed. No formal admission, no strategic positioning statement, and no overt attempt to reframe the commercial issue on their terms. And it was horrible to be silent. An organization's inability to control its own narrative doesn't just create a void in the modern media landscape. Everyone else is given the microphone. Fan communities across continents, rival sports organizations, tennis writers, and sports marketing analysts all scrambled to fill the interpretive gap left by the WTA. It was not a favorable story being written without them. Looking back, it showed a ruling body caught completely unprepared by a change that had been occurring for years. This delayed reaction had complex underlying structural factors. Working across multiple jurisdictions, the WTA concurrently balances conflicting interests from players, competitions, broadcasters, and well-known business partners. In normal circumstances, decision-making within that framework proceeds deliberately because deliberateness demonstrates responsibility governance. However, the circumstances surrounding IA's commercial boom were anything but typical. Speed was essential. Adaptation was crucial, and speed wasn't arriving. Meanwhile, individual sponsors, growing wary of the WTA's strategic orientation, began probing talks that months earlier would have been unthinkable. Brands that had maintained stable, mutually beneficial tour partnerships after years were suddenly asking basic questions about return on investment. Were the audiences that brands needed most still being reached by WTA-adjacent positions? Or had those viewers moved away from institutional channels entirely in pursuit of particular athletes, singular experiences, or distinct cultural moments? Tour leadership was really unhappy with the internal responses those brands were getting. There is no negotiating in digital analytics. Historic relationships are not respected by audience migration data, and the overwhelming finding of numerous independent commercial studies was the same. The WTA's ability to reach certain high-value audiences has significantly declined. While ISA's distinct platforms had simultaneously today, players throughout the tour begun seeing the downstream repercussions. Talking to potential personal sponsors was poignant. Historically citing WTA alliance alignment as a positive signal, brand representatives were suddenly either mentioning it less frequently or presenting it with historically unheard-of qualifications. The institutional support that had previously increased the commercial value of individual players was beginning to lose some of its allure. In an anonymous interview with sports journalists, veteran athletes conveyed their sincere anger. They had dedicated their professional lives to establishing the WTA's overall commercial standing. For many, the notion that institutional quiet during a crucial period of change might undermine years of teamwork felt like a serious leadership failure that was still unacknowledged. The lack of communication at the WTA was more than just a PR blunder. It served as a warning to all of the corporate partners who are presently assessing their involvement with women's tennis that the organization lacked the awareness or the resolve to manage its own change. That signal held significant weight for sponsors used to collaborating with forward-thinking, strategically articulate firms. There was a genuine cost associated with each day of institutional silence, and the bill was mounting quickly. Corporations never use the word withdrawal when they start discreetly reorganizing their financial obligations. It's always milder wording: changing investment priorities, reevaluating the portfolio, and strategic reallocation. However, the meaning remains the same beneath the meticulous corporate jargon. The funds are in motion, and it began to move with frightening speed in women's tennis. There was no dramatic announcement of the departures. Erosion of institutional sponsorship never works that way. It occurs when renewal discussions stop without agreements being reached, when option clauses expire without being activated, or when partnership agreements aren't renewed with the zeal or the resources they formerly demanded. The business basis started to reveal cracks gradually, and then all of a sudden, a number of well-known WTA businesses started shifting significant amounts of their sports marketing funds to individual athlete collaborations outside of tour arrangements. These choices were based on simple calculations that were very logical from a business standpoint. Tour-eyed placement data was consistently beaten by audience engagement measures centered around individual players, with Eala being the most dramatic example, albeit it's not the only one. The conclusion wasn't difficult for brands that maximized every marketing expenditure based on quantifiable audience response. This was instantly detected by the tournament ecosystem. Tighter financial limits were imposed on smaller WTA tournaments, which rely more tennis sponsorship revenue than television revenue. Discussions over prize funds get really complicated. The athletes who built the competitive backbone that made elite tennis feasible, the organizational infrastructure supporting hundreds of players on the professional tour, and the athletes themselves who would never command individual billion-dollar portfolios began to feel the strain. Seldom did this aspect of the repercussions receive much media attention. Eala's remarkable commercial success was the main storyline. The more subdued and important story was how her commercial appeal was hurting the athletes who would never directly benefit from it. Eala's sponsorship talks don't help a mid-ranked player competing in the second division of WTA tournaments. However, she loses everything if those discussions divert funds from the public infrastructure that supports her work. In the tennis world, a number of prominent voices started speaking out about this issue. The tone of the conversation was not hostile to Eala specifically. Almost everyone agreed that the situation wasn't her fault or her creation. The organizational leadership's perceived lack of adaptability and structural flaws in the sports advertisement architecture were the main sources of discontent. When assessing the scenario, sports economists noticed a troubling similarity with processes that had already caused other professional sports leagues to become unstable. Revenue distribution within the sport becomes fundamentally unbalanced when individual athlete commercial worth significantly exceeds institutional brand equity. Athletes with massive individual profiles are extremely valuable. Economic uncertainty is growing for everyone else. Financial instability occurs in the midst of the competitive field, which is critical for the long-term viability of any activity. The biggest chapters in women's tennis are currently being written, and you don't want to miss a single one, so if this story truly touched you, click subscribe.